Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 438, April 25th, 1980, and it's side one of the tape. You see, I had to get back to the music after all. I couldn't resist it. That's Blondie singing Accidents Never Happen in a Perfect World. Before we get on to the bulk of the tape, I do want to mention the passing of Jean-Paul Sartre this week. He was a big influence in my life, and I don't know how many heroes you people have, you young people growing up, but you better get some going when the going gets rough. You have to believe in somebody or something. I respected Sartre and Samuel Beckett also, the Irish writer who lived in Paris. They fought the Nazis hand to hand. They did clandestine work. They were in the street resistance during World War II. Sartre rejected the French Legion of Honor for his resistance activity. He also refused the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. He said he didn't want to be transformed into an institution. He offered us a philosophy which takes you right out to on the limb, called existentialism. There is no God, no fixed human nature. Man is responsible only to himself and to his fellow man. And Sartre believed that the commitment to a cause is the only thing that separates men from animals. The degree or proportion with which you commit yourself to the thing that you believe in is what makes you go up the scale maybe of 1 to 10, not like Bo Derek, but on an emotional, psychological, social level, the involvement and energy you put into the world to make this existence better, and this existence is all there is, according to Sartre, and I believe that. So use it and make time with it now. There's a famous quotation, I don't remember who said it, our blunders mostly come from letting our wishes interpret our duties, but there are men like Sartre that knew their duties, and when they had to do it, they did it, not for honors or any recognition, but because fascism is an evil thing, and life has to be free, and the freedom depends upon struggles, at times even the dirty part of the street fighting of the Nazis. Where is Richard Helms? I've mentioned that on other tapes, other times. Maybe I should offer a prize for somebody who comes up with an interview or any facts about Richard Helms. I believe he was seen at the hospital when the Shah of Iran was in the United States, but he is very silent on the Iranian crisis. He helped set up the Shah in Iran with Allen Dulles. He was behind the CIA activities through the past 35 years when it went from the OSS to the CIA. Outside of Allen Dulles, Helms was one of the most important men of American history who greased the slide that brought us down to where we are right now, the pits. But he's very invisible. John J. McCloy, Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, and other scoundrels are visible. But where is Richard Helms through this crisis? If you have any information, let me know. I can't find anything about him. Ronald Reagan addressed the California Congress, the Assembly, in 1968, February 16, 1968, with a speech, the Vietnam War will help boost employment, personal income, economic growth in California. Governor Reagan said California shared heavily in activities resulting from the Vietnam War. The importance of our defense and space industries makes this state a major source of new armaments for modern warfare. Vietnam War has contributed 153,000 jobs to the California economy between 1965 and 67, and he was rooting for the war because it made us in California very prosperous from the war. This is one way to solve inflation, unemployment, and a sagging economy. So when Reagan is president of the United States, the role he's wanted for a long time in the White House, you know ahead of time how he's going to solve that problem. I received a call from Los Angeles from a lawyer for the ACLU. They're filing a suit, the lawyer's name is Jerry Sperling, against the Los Angeles Police Department for the invasion of privacy, for the right to assemble and the freedom of speech. The various people who assembled at a conference at UCLA in 1975 were spied upon, and reports went to the Los Angeles Police Department. And Jeff Cohn, a researcher in Los Angeles, who at the time had organized with Don Freed the Campaign for Democratic Freedom at UCLA, is suing the police department. The attorney felt there was a good chance of something coming of it, and they called me because my name is in the files. I was a speaker at the conference, and they're filing suit against the Los Angeles police for taking down what we said and reporting who was there and putting it into their dossiers. That was in 1975, the conference was. Of course, this isn't anything new because my FBI files show that I've been under surveillance since 1967, so this was just years later. The conference was taking place and they were continuing to build up this dossier on me. I got a wonderful article from New Jersey from a listener who subscribes to the tapes. The title of the article is FBI Warned Errichetti of Mob Contract. This has to do with the mayor of Camden, New Jersey, Angelo J. Errichetti, and I still haven't been able to spend the weeks of background on the ab scam that I wanted. We're going into it a haphazard way, and I wanted to spend many weeks just in the groundwork of it, but there's been so much important news that I have put it off. Errichetti is not only the mayor of Camden, New Jersey, whose name has been mentioned in the ab scam scandals, but he's a state senator in New Jersey. He holds these jobs, and right after Angelo Bruno of organized crime was gunned down, the FBI offered Errichetti protection. Now, Errichetti felt that that was an excuse to surround him, and then the FBI would then offer him control and stop the investigation on him if he would be a potential witness in crime cases. And I did some back tapes, which you have or will have to order, on Angelo Bruno and the Philadelphia casino connections to London and to international organized crime and the gaming tables in New Jersey that are going there now. But he's one of the big dons of organized crime, and of course his murder was linked to ab scam. And the article, it's from the Courier Post this last week, says that the killing of Angelo Bruno was done as a reaction to the ab scam scandals, and I said there'll be many murders going, but this was a biggie. And the article goes on to say that the FBI informant had warned Errichetti that there was a contract out on his life, and he's involved right in the midst of New Jersey in all of these scandals. That there's a contract to kill him following the Bruno murder. The FBI informant did tell him that the Bruno murder with ab scam, with the links to ab scam, would affect Errichetti, and that he also would be murdered, Mayor Angelo J. Errichetti. Now the article goes on and says Errichetti's life has been threatened on 3 other occasions: during the Hanafi terrorist shootout in Washington, after San Francisco Mayor George Moscone was assassinated, and right after the gangland-style shootout of Major Coxon, C-O-X-O-N, a reputed South Jersey, Philadelphia heroin kingpin. Now, these large massacres, such as the Manson family and these Hanafi murder and these various packets where a segment of the population is slain and another group is held responsible for it, are part of a manipulated operation done by the CIA, the FBI, and I have many files on the Hanafi case in Washington, D.C. Maybe you don't remember those murders. There was a woman whose child was in a bathtub. The woman was killed. Black Muslims had their house broken into, and some Muslims were murdered. And at the time, other Muslims were held, as they said, they were competing with them and fighting an inner fight between the black Muslims, and yet there was somebody across the street who was seen fleeing the scene of the crime. It had nothing to do with the black Muslims. Well, I do have under my massacre section in my files on murders the story on the Hanafi terrorists, because I know these things someday will be terribly important, and if I don't say them now, we won't have them to look back later. But the George Moscone is the important name, because I did tapes on Jonestown, and that Moscone was #1 on the hit list if the people at Jonestown died, and that George Moscone was linked to the Howard Hughes organization, and now they have links to organized crime and Errichetti and the New Jersey gang. And it's very interesting that when George Moscone was assassinated, that the mayor of Camden, New Jersey, and a state senator from New Jersey would be on the death list, that it would affect a public official, a double public official in New Jersey when the mayor of San Francisco was killed, because the mayor there was linked to Jim Jones with his national and international connections to gun running, narcotics, slavery, and Nazi experimentations down in Jonestown. So now the next question is, how many newspapers are linking Errichetti and Abscam to Jonestown and Moscone? But the net gets bigger and wider for those of you that follow the information each week. You can see when you bring in Moscone to New Jersey and Jonestown. Remember when the people were all killed in Jonestown, there was a sudden death of some black people from Georgetown, from Guyana in New Jersey? Well, I'll have to go through my files. I have too much material this week anyway. I'll look through the files, but look up, if you have the article, some of you have, of the deaths of other people from Jonestown and Guyana in New Jersey, and I'm sure this will go back to the gaming tables, the narcotics, and the weapons that Jim Jones had, and also the assassination teams. You see, as I mentioned before, Jim Jones was trained assassins, mind-controlled zombie assassins who were out loose in the world, and the assassination teams were identified, part of them coming from New Jersey, in December when Frank Terpil from Washington and George Korkola from New Jersey were arrested. That case has been completely hushed up, and that linked to London, to Mr. Cummings, the arms merchant of the world, and also to Philadelphia and the Angelo Bruno links. We have to diagram those, I keep saying, and one subscriber has offered to help me do some of these diagrams. They're terribly important to put down, but now the article comes out that Errichetti, the mayor, Camden Mayor Angelo J. Errichetti, whose possible death is linked, if he were to be murdered, to Abscam, to international drug markets and so forth. They bring out the point that when George Moscone was murdered in San Francisco, Errichetti's life was in danger in New Jersey. The net and the web is coming together very nicely through all kinds of news articles that are being sent to me, and that I'm collecting also through books and articles. New York Times had an article last week, the Secretary of NATO in Brussels defected to East Germany. It wasn't a headline, it was just on the back of a little bit of a page. A Belgian secretary from the headquarters of NATO has defected to East Germany and asked for asylum. Interesting report, because it certainly didn't make the headlines, and we'll see what comes of that later. The news was filled with all kinds of death articles this week. G. Gordon Liddy from Time magazine, excerpts from his book, how he was going to kill Jack Anderson, why he was going to kill E. Howard Hunt, how he thought there were plans to kill him. Then an article by Spiro Agnew, how he feared for his life and thought that General Haig and Richard Nixon's administration were going to kill Spiro Agnew. I'm going to go into those in detail in a few minutes. Before I do, I just want to tell you there's a publication, I don't know if you know about it, called Facts on File. I don't know if you can get these books. You can write research, and I'll give you the address again and see if Tom Davis can get them for you. But it's a company that has all kinds of facts. They have a directory on multinational enterprises, profiles of corporations and their subsidiaries, articles on the assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, presidential succession, Ford, Rockefeller, and the 25th Amendment. But one of the books that's advertised that I do have to get someday is called Obituaries on File, 25,000 Most Prominent Deaths from 1940 to 1978, a biographical dictionary based on a compilation of deaths of prominent people in alphabetical order with international entries of politics, sports, arts, science. The entries include the date, the place of birth, the office they held, and the age at the time of death. And then they have them categorized into nationalities, occupation, interests, and works, and a unique index of deaths by date. This is a volume. It's $75, but I would love to take that volume and mark off from my files. What I started doing, investigating the John Kennedy assassination, became just a minor part of work, because my drawers and my filing cabinets are just filled, one drawer after another with deaths in alphabetical order, deaths of primary witnesses at the time of trials, and murders and hit runs, and all different ways of dying that the CIA admits that they do, and the possibility of people such as Hale Boggs or J. Edgar Hoover or Lyndon Johnson, what they were doing at the time they died, what they were saying, and when they died. And I would love to check off the files that I have to these obituaries on file. This is 25,000 of the most prominent deaths from 1940 to 1978. They get this out every 5 years, and the last one was 1978, so we'll miss 2 years last two. But imagine now that somebody's compiling these into volumes so that you can begin to take the research of the suspicious circumstances and put them together. If you take 25,000 of these deaths and 5,000 or 6,000 of them were murders that people have admitted they did, or attempted murderers who succeeded getting these people, but talk about other murders such as G. Gordon Liddy. He talked about attempting to murder Jack Anderson and E. Howard Hunt, but he worked with a man who had murdered 22 other people, including rope hangings, and he talks about the way they're murdered and how you do it and his context for murder. So he's not talking about who he murdered, but his attempted. But imagine that these 25,000 are dead. How many of those were murders in order to get us to the verge of a total fascism and on the brink of World War III? How many of these people had to die to get us at the place that we're at today? Did you see David Hartman and Jack Anderson and G. Gordon Liddy sitting and laughing about the plans that Liddy had to murder and the murders that he did, and Hartman shaking his hands as if he were greeting a great celebrity and honoring this person instead of investigating more of the Watergate murders? I saw it on TV. It was pretty disgusting. I'll quickly run down the deaths of the week, or some of them that I just got from this week's news, and without too much comment, so that you have an idea of what's taking place. Right in front of you, if you read your papers, I don't know how many you read. Most of you read them. Many people who just listen to radio programs once a week take this as their source of news for the week instead of keeping up with the papers 7 days a week. That was my objection to being on KLRB every week, was that it became the news thing for a group of people to hear 1 day a week, and then the rest of the week they didn't do any work or studying. And I felt that people invest in the tapes, they can play them over and over again, and if they want to, they can take them seriously, and that's why I discontinued going down to the radio station every week. Did you see NBC News this week, April 21st, 6:50 p.m., just before the end of the hour? There was a scene down in Miami, Florida, of anti-Castro Cubans, the Omega-7 and the Alpha-66. They were also on 60 Minutes this last week. But there was a picture of them training, crawling on the ground, shooting with their guns, practicing their wars. And one of them looked at the camera and said, this training is to go into Cuba and get Fidel Castro, but it is more than that. It is to get communists anywhere. And then in that brief moment on NBC, he said it is to go after communists in the United States. That is the beginning of the war, the civil war in the United States, of certain factions against the masses, the Chicanos, the blacks, the working people, the people that are trying to raise their standard of living, who will be exploited and eliminated, probably through alternative three-or plans like that, because there are no provisions for jobs or housing or health in the future for these masses of people in this country. And I would say that looking at that man in my screen at the dinner hour and having him look back and saying that he will be shooting inside the United States is really the beginning of the takeover of America, verbally and physically. And they went on to say that their shooting is legal, it's on private property, the weapons are legal, and they can practice all that they want. So you better get ready like Sart and Beckett and have some force or idea of what to do when these people come after you. The arrest in Chicago of the FALN members, they are people that cause violence, terrorists. In the United States, they're a group of allegedly wanting Puerto Rican independence. They're responsible for more than 100 bombings in Chicago, Miami, New York City, Washington, and Puerto Rico. They've killed 5 people and they've injured 70 others. They could have been caught after the first person died and after 4 people were injured, but they were arrested in April of this month in Chicago. Why were they arrested at this time and they've been allowed to go so long? The main reason I believe they were arrested was for the same reason that the Republicans and the Liddy gang couldn't have violence at the conventions in Miami in 1972. is that the money and the funding would go directly back to the Central Intelligence Agency, so they had to call off the operations. This Carlos Torres and the group of terrorists that call themselves involved with the Puerto Rican group, the FALN, have been linked to the assassination teams in New Jersey, to the weapons of Mitchell Werbel in Georgia. These people are linked to Frank Terpil in Washington, D.C. of the CIA, and they also were exposed as being connected to Mr. Korkola in New Jersey and to Mr. Cummings, the arms merchant in London, who is arming the entire world and going on down to Colonia Dignidad with the Nazi arms merchants, gun running, and narcotics operations. Now, they had to pull these people in because their headquarters are in Newark, New Jersey, and Abscam is breaking, and also the arrest of Terpil and Korkola in December prohibited their continuing their violence because it would be linked to the Central Intelligence Agency. They were planning demonstrations and killings in Madison Square Garden. I've been mentioning Madison Square Garden on past tapes for the past few weeks because that's where Jean Harris worked for a year and a half before she went down to the school in McLean, Virginia, the woman that killed Dr. Tarnower. Have you noticed how silent all these cases are of these murders? The 33 killed in the New Jersey jail the night the Abscam story broke, and the case of Dennis Sweeney killing Alan Lowenstein and Jean Harris killing Dr. Tarnower. You don't see a thing about those cases in the news. They're just sitting quiet. Well, the Democrats are having their convention, and the FALN members were planning violence there. And I believe that if the men had not been arrested in New York City in December, Terpil and Korkola, linking them to Cummings and that money to FALN, to this group, then they wouldn't have had to pull them in. But if this group had done the violence, and there were already articles in the New York Times listing them to the Central Intelligence Agency, then the CIA would be responsible for the murder of Democrats at the convention, possibly the murder of Mondale, Vice President Mondale, Jimmy Carter, and so forth. They were planning violence. The same kind of violence was planned for the Republican convention down in Miami, and it was called off because the money was linked to the Central Intelligence Agency, and they couldn't afford to have that violence take place. That's why I think the FLAN was arrested in Chicago. They've had a lot of evidence of who they were. As I say, 5 murders and 70 injuries and massive destruction of housing and apartment buildings and bombings. And then, of all things, this group was going to go on to the convention to do their violence with headquarters in New Jersey, their bombs and weapons coming from the group that have been linked to the assassination teams in the past. What other violences were there this week? There were articles in the paper out here, it's time to drop the bomb on Iran. 2 black women were shot in Tennessee on their legs and buttocks and thighs as they left a beer place to go and have a drink. They went around the corner and they were shot. Members of the Klan have been arrested. A black girl, 9 years old, in Georgia was wounded by a shotgun going after her in a mobile home park following racial demonstrations. 2 little blonde Nazi children, about 4 and 5 years old, were photographed AP wire service, their hands in the air, wearing white power shirts with swastikas. This was in North Carolina. President Tolbert of Liberia was gunned down, and the United States government is very friendly to the assassins. They've already made peace, so it's too early to study the history of why he was killed or what interest the United States had in that country that he was holding back or developing, but that was another coup last week. The Turkish ambassador from the Vatican was ambushed in a bullet-riddled car. He didn't die. His predecessor, Vatican Representative Mr. Karam, was killed in Rome in 1977 by Armenian terrorists. The story is that they didn't like the policies of the Vatican from 1890 until 1920, and therefore they killed a man in 1977 and tried to kill the Vatican representative just this last week. I don't know how far back we're going to go for these assassinations or vengeance, or whether these are just shifts of policy and the excuse for the motive is to get rid of some of the more liberal members of the church. I know this story of why Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy is that he wanted a place in history or was jealous of John Kennedy with so much malarkey. So I really can't believe that the Armenians would risk their life and shoot for something that happened in 1890, a representative of the Vatican at this time. There's an assassination attempt on Prime Minister Gandhi in India this last week. She's made a rapprochement with Pakistan. Pakistan turned down our offer of $400 million, and India and Pakistan seem to be getting close. I don't know whether it's a case of divide and conquer, but the man who was accused of wanting to stab her was himself stabbed in the stomach, and I don't know whether he's on the brink of death, about to die. At this point, it's similar to killing Jack Ruby killing Lee Harvey Oswald before you find out the whole story. That fellow has also been stabbed, and we won't know much about his condition or why he really wanted to kill Mrs. Gandhi or who put him up to it. I'm sure that he won't survive this condition in the hospital there, and it'd be a good one to get away. 2 assassination attempts in the world, in Liberia and India, the same week. One worked and the other was a near miss. The alleged assailant, the one who did the stabbing or wanted to stab Mrs. Gandhi, himself was stabbed, and so if there was a plot, it ends right there. Jimmy the Weasel Fratriano of organized crime, as his picture in the San Francisco Examiner, he's been what they call a big hit. The ex-hitman, now a big hit in trials. I mentioned last week how he talked about in a trial of killing 6 people and being part of other murders, but he was a primary witness against a man who was convicted and found guilty of taking money, several $1,000s, from the Teamsters Union, Mr. Tham. Various informers for the federal government don't live long when they talk about organized crime and murders, but Fratriano is a well-known organized crime figure, and he's been testifying for the federal government, and he's going on down to Florida soon to testify in an important case. His first public appearance recently was in Manhattan last year, involving a skimming fraud in Westchester Premier Theater. I'm watching the name Westchester and the city in terms of a lot of action with Abscam and the death of Dr. Tanauer there. But he's going to be used all over the country. Instead of getting a death penalty in Cleveland, Ohio, for murders that he had done or participated in, he is being allowed to remain free if he testifies and catches some of these other people on burglaries or petty crimes. I don't know. He's not getting anybody for the charge of murder, and while he himself participated in murders, he's nailing people who took $2,000 from the Teamsters Fund. Really a strange twist, and he'll be around the country down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in the trial of Mr. Della Croce, who is the boss of the late Carlo Gambino's family. That will be interesting to see hitman Jimmy the Weasel Fratriano testifying against members of Carlo Gambino's family. Last week there was a picture of Frank Sinatra with Carlo Gambino and Jimmy Fratriano. It was in the paper. Gregory De Palma, Frank Sinatra, Thomas Marson. A fivesome, and now Frank Sinatra is being investigated for federal skimming and his links to Gambino. And as I say, Fratriano will be testifying against the Gambino family. So a few fireworks should be flying across the country as long as Jimmy the Weasel keeps testifying. He's going to bring more people into this net, and it'll get more interesting all the time. We should have some really good crime family charts and just put a circle about which fruit or member of the family is knocked off as the testimony begins and which become the informers. On the other side of the tape, we'll do some more on current killings and more on the book The Hoffa Wars and Irv Davidson, the public relations man, and Spiro Agnew and G. Gordon Liddy. This is Mae Brussell, and it's tape number 438, April 25th, 1980, and it's side 2 of the tape. Did you read last week in the newspaper that David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, is asking for veteran benefits? He says that his mental injury, happened at the time he was in the service. He has military records as a rifleman and skill as a clerk, and he worked for the police department when he came home. And if any good investigation were done into David Berkowitz, they'd find that he was a subject of mind control while he was in Korea, stationed in Korea. He was many veterans of Korea, Mr. Romero from SLA fame, and the civil rights movement, Dennis Sweeney, who killed Alan Lowenstein. These people, political activists that turned into murderers, were victims of mental hospital zombie control, which was the government's vengeance for letting them take an anti-establishment view of history. There is one matter I just want to take care of, a small article in the paper out here that you wouldn't see. There's a group that tried to have a rock concert in Monterey to duplicate the Monterey Pop, to get into the spirit that existed in 1967 out here, and it didn't quite get off the ground, but at the concert people were handing out acid, and it was free, whoever wanted it, and of course I'm very leery of this kind of generosity. And at the time of the concert, while it was going on or shortly afterwards, a young woman fell over a bridge right near the concert grounds, just a block away. The border of the Monterey Fairgrounds is right next to this bridge. And this woman fell over the bridge, and they said it was suicide. And then a gentleman was charged with her murder, a man by the name of Michael Lively. And he was charged with holding Victoria Allgood, she's 21 years old, with her feet dangling over the bridge by the ankles and then dropping her. And this was brought to the court here in Monterey, and the Superior Court dismissed it. This last December they dismissed the entire case, and then they took it to a higher court where they announced this week that it will stay indefinitely. That the man who was charged with this murder won't be tried, evidently, and either dismissed or not tried at all, and the whole purpose was to associate violence, again, with the movement, with the young people, with music, and I'm sure that was it. And as with all provocateurs of this type, they get off and the charges are dropped, and they're in limbo, and he won't be charged with the murder, even though the description of how she died, being held by her ankles and dropped 30 feet, is very clear, and there evidently had to be witnesses to know the details, but he won't be charged with that murder. I'm very proud of my research on the John Kennedy assassination. I spent 8 years cross-filing the Warren Commission hearings, exhibits, and documents, the 26 volumes, and consider myself to know as much about the murder of John Kennedy as anybody in the United States. And I've done a lot of hard work on that investigation. And one of the things that I have stressed over the years is the fact that the decision to kill John Kennedy began long before the intent to withdraw the troops from Southeast Asia in 1964, or pulling back from the Bay of Pigs, not killing Fidel Castro, and having the invasion called off. That was one of the incidences that further triggered the assassins' plans to kill John Kennedy. But I've maintained, on the basis of 16 years research, going into the 17th year, that the decision to kill Kennedy began in 1960, as soon as he was to be nominated for President of the United States, that the people in power, the organized crime, the business concerns, did not want John Kennedy as president, and that as soon as he got the nomination, that's when the assassination teams were set up. When Robert Mayu, representing the Howard Hughes Organization, the CIA, the FBI, met at the Plaza Hotel in April of 1960 with members of organized crime to set up assassination teams. This was the muscle for what was to become a long series of deaths: John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and the hundreds of witnesses that would be involved in this case. Last week I talked about, it was 2 weeks ago, Irv Davidson, the very important man mentioned in the Bry Lab and the Abscam investigations as being sort of the head of the octopus, the man who had the connecting link to the various elements of the assassination. The links of John Kennedy, just sticking to that one assassination or the assassination teams. He had the connections to Jimmy Hoffa and Jack Ruby and Sam Giancana, the Chicago, Dallas organized crime group. He had the connections to New Orleans, to Carlos Marcellos and Traficanta. He had the Washington connections to the news media, Jack Anderson and Drew Pearson earlier. He had the international connections, the national connections to pull off this murder. He was close to Murchison, in whose home J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon were the night before John Kennedy was killed. This was a meeting place before the assassination. Irv Davidson seems to be a connecting link to all of that. And in the book, The Hoffa Wars, that I've quoted on several other tapes, tape 431, and going back to the assassination of John Kennedy and the assassination teams and certain trials taking place in New Jersey and Abscam story breaking. In the book, The Hoffa Wars, there is a section on Davidson, and I gave you some pages, tape 436 on the printed sheet from the index, about Irv Davidson, where his name was mentioned. But I want to go specifically on this tape into what this author is saying, Dan Moldau, M-O-L-D-E-A, about Irv Davidson, that is on those pages that I didn't have time for on the tape, and show you how important he is to Permindex, to the Torbett document that many of you researchers have, which is a 200-page, 200 to 300-page document on the framework of the assassination of John Kennedy, incorporating the Bahama connections and John Connally and the Solidaris, the White Russian Nazi connections, and those are the Werbel, the Chilean connections, the weapons, the assassination teams. This book, The Hoffa War, tells about Davidson's connections not only to Jimmy Hoffa, but the motive that Jimmy Hoffa had and organized crime had for killing John Kennedy with the assistance of the Texas officials. On page 108 of this book, it tells that Davidson was active among the Democrats as well as the Republicans. At the 1960 Democratic Convention in Los Angeles, Davidson had a meeting between Hoffa and Lyndon Johnson and his old friend John Connally. Connally's name comes through the assassination loud and clear, and it's Connally who has the property down at Tyrol Bay in Jamaica, where the top Nazis and industrialists go for their vacations and their espionage activities. This book says that Hoffa promised to support Lyndon Johnson, and he would support anybody except Kennedy. The organized crime people hated Robert Kennedy when he was in the Senate with the McClellan Committee investigating organized crime. Now, just one reference of Irv Davidson in the book The Hoffa War tells about Irv Davidson's introducing these various people like Hoffa and having meetings between Hoffa and Lyndon Johnson and John Connally. That's the Texas connection. And that they would support Lyndon Johnson after the Adlai Stevenson failed, and when Kennedy got the nomination. That's when these people got together and met. This book confirms what I have known for a long time in the chain of network that happened in 1960 when John Kennedy got the nomination. This author, Moldau, says that the same month before the first of the Kennedy-Nixon debates that began September the 26th, Jimmy Hoffa made a trip to New Orleans to meet Carlos Marcello, another close associate of Irv Davidson, and allegedly Marcello had a suitcase filled with $500,000 to go to Richard Nixon, a $500,000 contribution, and the other $500,000 was going to come from the mob in New Jersey and Florida. You see how the Bry Lab and the Abscam and Irv Davidson melt together, and Hoffa supported Richard Nixon. It was a question of anybody but the Kennedys. And Attorney General William Rogers, who was linked to the Bahamas, to organized crime and the Mary Carter Paint Company, and later he was Secretary of the State, he was Attorney General, and now on the Pahlavi Foundation with the Shah of Iran. He let Hoffa off the hook and with a slap of the wrist for possible arrest. But this book describes in 1960 how Richard Nixon had intervened with the Justice Department on Hoffa's behalf. It involved a Sun Valley indictment. Nixon was then vice president, And it tells how if Robert Kennedy, this is a quotation, had Robert Kennedy been the Democratic candidate that seemed likely in 1968, that he would have again gone after organized crime, so that the cozy relationship of the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa and Fred Simmons of the Teamsters were very close to Richard Nixon and against Robert Kennedy. And it also explains how when John Mitchell was the Attorney General, then Richard Nixon brought in Murray Chotiner of organized crime, who was close to Carlos Marcello and the assassination team that had been active in the 60s against John Kennedy, and how Nixon got favors from Carlos Marcello, all of this money, and that Irv Davidson, this important man, was a close friend of Marcello. The book says both Carlos Marcello and Trafficante survived Nixon's war against organized crime rather well. Trafficante came through the Nixon year with an unblemished record. Marcello only had a small indictment. He had 6 months in jail for assaulting an FBI agent while Nixon was president. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations was investigating John Kennedy's murder, they concluded at the very end that it possibly could involve Carlos Marcello and Santos Trafficante. But, of course, this book, The Hoffa War, goes back to the introduction by Davidson of Hoffa to John Connally and Lyndon Johnson and those Texas people that would be involved with Richard Nixon at the time that John Kennedy was killed. The stories that are being investigated now with Abscam and Brylab go right back to the plans in 1960 to kill John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy when John Kennedy won the nomination over Adlai Stevenson or Lyndon Johnson and then won the election from Richard Nixon. And at that point, the mobsters and the CIA and the FBI got together to set up the assassination teams to kill the Kennedy brothers. Spiro Agnew, the former vice president, has a book coming out called Go Quietly or Else, published by William Morrow, and there's some excerpts of the book and interviews, and he surfaced this week saying that he feared for his life at the time of Watergate and that he resigned as vice president because he was afraid that he would be murdered, and he blamed General Haig, who was in the White House at the time, and claimed that General Mike Dunn came back from a meeting with Haig and said that Agnew would be murdered. The actual story about Spiro Agnew and his involvement in Watergate and getting out of the role of vice presidency with just a slap on the wrist had more to do with Richard Nixon firing Spiro Agnew after Watergate because Nixon thought he would be murdered. And in 1972, in the Realist article, my first published article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, I talked about the people that arrested at the Watergate, and at that time the name of G. Gordon Liddy hadn't even come out. This article was written 3 weeks after the arrest, and it mentioned the suspect, the man from New York, who hadn't even been named yet. But I referred to the offices of Robert Bennett of Mullen and Company, which are really the Howard Hughes offices in Washington, D.C., the public relation firm in 1969 that was with the Central Intelligence Agency, and Douglas Caddy from the CIA was heading that office. He was co-founder of Young Americans for Freedom, and this group had brought in Germans to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, American Nazis that were stationed in Germany that were brought to Dallas at the time of Kennedy's assassination. And Douglas Caddy and the group from Robert Mullins were really supporting Spiro Agnew to be president of the United States. And I mentioned that in the article. I referred to Robert Mullen as the co-founder of Young Americans for Freedom, along with William Buckley, and that they wanted Agnew as president, and that they had set up a fund of $10 million for dirty tricks and espionage that involved the killing of Richard Nixon at the Republican convention and making Agnew president of the United States. This team were working to murder Richard Nixon, and I wrote in 1972 that Patrick Gray, the graduate of Annapolis, the acting director of the FBI at the time, had covered up murders of various people in Los Angeles, the Isla Vista riots in Santa Barbara, the murder of Ruben Salazar and Jerry Lee Amé, and that his job was to cover up the investigation of the George Wallace shooting and, of course, the murder of J. Edgar Hoover just a week before George Wallace was shot. I went quite at length in the article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, into the role of Spiro Agnew and his links to the Greek military junta and the Nazis in power that were put in power in Greece by the CIA, and that they wanted Agnew as the President of the United States, and that all of them were pushing for Agnew to be president, and the plans did exist to kill Richard Nixon and make Agnew president. In fact, I wrote in the article, this was in 1972, that the money for these murders and assassinations, and of course this week, as I say, the men were talking about plans to kill them. Liddy thought he was going to be killed. He thought he would get orders from Charles Colson to kill E. Howard Hunt if he talked. They were to kill Jack Anderson. They talked about the attempts, not who they actually did kill. But I wrote in 1972 that the CIA funds went from Washington to Chile and then to Mexico and then to Miami to be set up for these assassination teams. Now, Chile, at that time, I didn't know about Operation Condor that Jack Anderson is writing about now. I didn't know about Colonial Dignidad or the nest of Nazis that had gone from Mexico, written up in the Torbett document from Oaxaca, Mexico. But this nest of Nazis had been down in South America for a long, long time, 30, 40 years, and they went there as soon as the war was over, or just before it was over, World War II. But I went at length in the article on how there were plans to kill Richard Nixon. Keep in mind, I wrote that in August of 1972, and I asked, can persons associated with the extreme radical right wing of the Republican Party who think Nixon is a pinko because he went to Russia and China or didn't invade Cuba, be financed through the CIA to create martial law and then kill Richard Nixon? And I mentioned the same CIA that offered the Greek colonels assistance for that coup d'etat said that Richard Nixon could only run for presidency if he took Spiro Agnew as vice president. Now, as soon as the tape was at the Watergate Hotel and Nixon was caught, he knew that his days were over as president of the United States, that his team of dirty tricksters that were operating to keep him in business were caught, but they were caught purposely by tape left on the door from James McCord, who worked with the CIA, the FBI, and the Pentagon and the Spiro Agnew faction. So as soon as Watergate arrest took place, long before Richard Nixon was going to be impeached, he pulled the rug out from Spiro Agnew because Nixon then would be killed and Agnew would be president. Agnew is writing that he feared for his life, but everyone in Washington was fearing for their lives. James McCord was told by Mr. Caulfield that he was going to be killed. G. Gordon Liddy thought he was going to be killed, as I say. And death was the story of the day, and it's very much in the news right now. As a matter of fact, in Midnight newspaper, it came out July 12, 1976. That was 4 years after Watergate. I did an article, 33 witnesses met violent deaths that were Watergate related. And in 1976, that seemed very outrageous to people who haven't studied the murder witnesses to the John Kennedy assassination. But I named these 30 witnesses plus the 41 extra that were on the plane of Dorothy Hunt, which would be 71 witnesses within 4 years, major witnesses to the Watergate story. But as Liddy talks about killing people and being able to kill people, you see that those deaths are possible and were possible, and that death was the thing that each one there was worried about that he would meet next because his involvement of what he knew. G. Gordon Liddy has a book coming out called Will, and some excerpts of it were in Time magazine this last week, and there are certain points of it that get mixed by the news media. They get mixed in the context and ignored totally. What makes the headlines is G. Gordon Liddy wanted to kill E. Howard Hunt. G. Gordon Liddy wanted to kill Jack Anderson. G. Gordon Liddy thought he would be killed. But briefly going through the Time magazine article, in case you didn't read it, or bringing out certain points, I want to just share with you some of the things that were in Time that I see in it that are being ignored by the mass media. He talked about the CIA being involved in Chappaquiddick. They're not supposed to work domestically. He told how they provided cartoons of Ted Kennedy and Chappaquiddick for the news media. He doesn't say which cartoonists or which newspapers, but they provided cartoons. G. Gordon Liddy was born in Hoboken, New Jersey. Of course, New Jersey is an interesting state with the offices of I.G. Farben during the war and the tremendous organized crime killer team, headquarters for a lot of training for the FALN, the Alpha 66, the anti-Castro Cubans, the Moonies. There's a lot of political extremism going on in New Jersey, and G. Gordon Liddy was born over there in New Jersey. He became an FBI agent. In 1957, he passed the bar, and in 57 became an FBI agent. I like the year 57. That was the year that Howard Hughes was literally kidnapped by the CIA and kept prisoner starting in 57. Of course, that's the year that Candy Jones was given her second personality, and the mind control was begun on her. And that was the year of the Appalachian meeting of organized crime to redistribute and redirect the direction of the mobsters to divide up the United States. Liddy went to the Treasury Department in 1969. Maybe his book will tell you, but the article in Time doesn't tell you that Gerald Ford from the Warren Commission got G. Gordon Liddy the job for the Treasury Department, and he was there just the years that they were doing assassinations and assassination attempts. He tells about getting LSD to give to Timothy Leary, but what he says that the CIA supplies these drugs that made people look delirious and sick or silly to discredit them. We know that already, and we've heard the story, but Liddy is very matter of fact, and nobody from the CIA has ever been put on the carpet about it. He talks in his book about the Gemstone file, and of course the destruction at the committee to re-elect the president, the destruction of the files, had to do with their operations of counterintelligence, and the main operation, in case many of you didn't know, it was called Diamond, and that was the counter demonstrations that were to take place at the San Diego convention that was later moved to Miami. And it involved drugging people, kidnapping them, fixing them up with prostitutes, taking them over to Mexico, and using professional killers who had already killed 22 people. The gist of the article I wrote 3 weeks after the Watergate arrest had to do with Gemstone under the category of Diamond, and I didn't have the operation name, and it had to do with the riots and discrediting the radicals and killing Richard Nixon and using disguised hippies and counterintelligence agents for riots and demonstrations and violence at the conventions. And now he's coming out with what he has to say in his book exactly coincides with what I wrote 8 years ago in 1972. They had their Diamond operation with their 22 killers. Their Gemstone included Ruby to demonstrate and infiltrate demonstrations with spies, and Coal, which is black and not a precious jewel, was to follow Shirley Chisholm and have a black woman break up the votes of the Democrats and cause a lot of problems and divide them against each other, just as they're talking about Anderson might possibly use Barbara Jordan. Again, a woman, take votes away from any of the Democrats to make sure that Reagan wins. The same tricks are going on. That's why it's so important to study them. Emerald was to chase planes and follow up on the buses and the entourage of the various people that were running for office, and Quartz was the microwave interception of telephones, and then the crystal operation of Gemstone was the use of prostitutes and mirrors and king-size beds and very fine ladies that weren't ordinary street prostitutes to blackmail members of Congress and well-known politicians for future use. And he talks about Operation Turquoise, which had to do with the blueprints for the convention halls. He said they wanted to turn off the air conditioning in Miami, but they wanted to make the people uncomfortable and sabotage the room so they'd be hot. I wrote in 1972, 8 years ago, I didn't give it a name. I said that they got floor plans of the convention halls from the architect who built the building, and that they could use chemicals in the air conditioning plant, that if they murdered a candidate, just as Robert Kennedy was killed in the Ambassador Hotel, if you murdered a major candidate, you could have people lose their memory through vapors and chemicals in the air conditioning ducts. He describes Operation Turquoise in 1980. Even though I didn't have the name for it, I had access, after I wrote my first article, to the Gemstone File, or one called the Gemstone File by Bruce Roberts. But I wrote 8 years ago very much what G. Gordon Liddy is writing about now, and nobody has talked about, were the very carefully laid plans for violence and counterintelligence at the convention in Miami. That's why I say the FALN were arrested before the violence at Madison Square Garden this summer, because they would be directly linked to the CIA. And after the arrest at the Watergate Hotel, the violence of the conventions wasn't allowed to go through because it would be linked to the CIA, the FBI, and the Pentagon. We didn't have that kind of information in 1968, and that's why there were so many riots in Chicago at the time. G. Gordon Liddy talks about arranging death, and one way they do it, he said, and they considered this for Jack Anderson, and it isn't important whether or not Jack Anderson lived or died at this point. The techniques are what are important. One way is to give people LSD or chemicals in their drinks, and then they lose control of the car, and they have car crashes. How many deaths of those 27,000 deaths cataloged in facts on file were car crashes? That's why I'm anxious to get a hold of that book. He also talks about arranging street crimes. If somebody is mugged on the street of Washington, if you take a person who's talking about Watergate or Watergate evidence and you have an accident, Murray Chotiner of organized crime, who was the link of John Mitchell's Justice Department to Carlos Marcello and Santos Trafficante, and these people had a car crash. Clay Shaw had a car crash. Primary witnesses had crashes. And then there's muggings in Washington, D.C., robberies of civil rights leaders and so forth that I've talked about. And Liddy talks about those. He talks about using Army scramblers to use for their counterintelligence operations, going out to the Air Force missile base to talk about the men that were arrested with the dirty tricks. James McCord was part of that 16-man emergency team, if we had martial law, who worked with the Army missile base, and Richard Nixon's team could cover up their operations by using these secret telephones. The other important point I want to make before this tape is over is that he was waiting in prison when G. Gordon Liddy was arrested. He was in prison, and he was arranging to kill E. Howard Hunt, who was also in jail. And he was waiting for a word from Charles Colson, the born-again Christian from the White House, the attorney for Richard Nixon in charge of dirty tricks. But he said he could direct the murders from prison, that he would have himself put in solitary confinement so that at the time it wouldn't look like he did it. But from his prison cell, he could tell the guards and members of the syndicate who to poison. And the point is that many prisoners, many primary witnesses, many people are murdered in prison, and the guards supply the poison to the persons. And G. Gordon Liddy had the power to order the murders from his cell if he wanted to. The fact that it didn't happen to Hunt doesn't mean it didn't happen to other Watergate witnesses, or it isn't going on today, just as the death of those 33 people in New Mexico on the eve of the Abscam story had to do with informers, government informers who were talking about members of organized crime, or the links of judges and police departments to murders and organized crime. They were on a protective cell, and it's that cell that they went to the files and got the names and the keys and killed them, and we haven't heard a thing about the people who did the killing. He tells how he could poison, how he could order from his cell, that he had the means when he was in the cell to put food into diet trays. Hunt had a special diet tray. So G. Gordon Liddy, a member of the FBI, the CIA, the Treasury Department, could order poison from where he is in a jail to kill another government official who's also in jail. It's that kind of power that is important, the potential to order it and the way to cover up. He talks about the way you cover up, isolating yourself so they don't link you to it if Hunt had died. But the point is that he has the potential, and that the people who run the jails cooperate with murdering witnesses, that they will poison who you want, they will put you into isolation, and these are the things that I know are happening. But the Liddy book is important because he gives a clue to some of the techniques, and that's so important. Well, this is a dismal tape, a lot of deaths and so forth. I wish the news was nicer. I can't think of a way to make it better. I feel the only way to solve a problem is to admit it. The only way to cure a disease is to diagnose it. And the only purpose of recognizing these conditions is to hope for something better. And besides hoping, doing the actual physical work or involvement of exposing. And that's all we can do, or that's a start. In the meantime, you take care of yourself. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. And we'll be back together next week with a little more grisly news, but at least an awareness of what is happening and maybe some ways to counteract it in the course of our lifetime. In the meantime, you take care, and I'll be back with you next week.